There are places in this world where the walls remember screams that history has tried to erase, places where prayers dissolve into shadows, and the silence hides something older than faith, something far more ruthless. For over 160 years, the Catholic Church has whispered one name behind locked cathedral doors, a name they have spent millions to bury beneath false records, sealed archives, and graves without markers. Saint Hope Convent. Most men have never heard of it. You weren't supposed to. But once I tell you this, once these truths are in your bloodstream, there's no unknowing them. You'll never walk into a chapel, glance at a nun, or hear a church bell without remembering what I'm about to say. In 1854, on the wind-swept shores of Lake Michigan, 23 women vanished behind the stone walls of Saint Hope Convent. Gone, erased, their existence stripped from ledgers, stripped from parish records, stripped from the official story, as if they had never walked this earth. But they did, and their blood still stains the forgotten soil beneath those limestone walls. The church said it was an error, an administrative mix-up, a translation problem from the old Irish documents, but the private letters, the hidden testimony of inspectors, and a sealed cache of human remains uncovered during quiet renovations in 2009 tell a far darker story. And that story, forbidden, chilling, heretical to speak, is why you're here. Because some men aren't content with the lies. Some men demand the dangerous truth, so listen carefully. This is the descent you were never meant to take, and once we start, there's no light at the end of this tunnel. Take a breath. We begin. Now. It began like so many tragedies hidden beneath religious banners, with whispered promises of mercy, cloaked in power, ambition, and quiet desperation. The year was 1854. Wisconsin's dense northern frontier stretched endless, untamed, a land of pine forests, jagged coastlines, and settlers clawing out a future in the wilderness. Protestant Germans and Scandinavians dominated these communities, carving wooden chapels beside frozen fields. But at the edge of Lake Michigan, something else was rising. Something colder than the northern wind, harder than the stone that built it. Saint Hope Convent. A fortress of faith, they called it. But even the stone walls couldn't conceal what would fester inside. The church's expansion into Protestant territory wasn't a mission. It was a chess move. Bishop William Quarter, the Vatican's quiet architect of influence, arrived in Wisconsin that spring with a singular purpose: establish an institution powerful enough to bend the spiritual loyalties of the frontier, or crush them. He purchased a forgotten estate, the crumbling mansion of a ruined lumber baron, 30 acres of forest shielding it from prying eyes. 3 wings, Gothic stonework, narrow windows like slit eyes watching the world. It was to be the church's foothold in the wilderness, an orphanage, infirmary, and refuge for widows, wrapped beneath the authority of Saint Hope. But those walls, they held more than stone. Mother Superior Catherine Murphy arrived with 20 young women, Irish, devout, expendable. Their black habits marked them as outsiders. Their soft accents betrayed their distance from home. They came in service of God, but not all who arrived would leave. The locals watched them with suspicion. Men muttered beneath their beards. Women clutched their children tighter at the sight of the nuns walking in pairs through the woods. Whispers swirled about ancient Catholic rituals, relics smuggled from Europe, practices older than the Bible itself. But it wasn't superstition that would damn Saint Hope. It was what they found beneath the floorboards, and the screams that echoed from behind locked chapel doors long after the candles were extinguished. You see, every empire, even a holy one, has its sacrificial lambs. The church, it was already preparing theirs. The first disappearance was dismissed. They always are. Sister Mary Collins, 22, flame-haired, too young to understand the machinery she'd been fed into, gone, vanished between evening vespers and morning prayer. The official story: exhaustion. A young novice overcome by homesickness, slipping away in the night, perhaps into the forest, perhaps onto a passing trade ship at the port. A tragedy, yes, but nothing more. That's what they told the town. That's what the bishop whispered to the congregation. That's what the nuns were ordered to believe. But in the shadows of Saint Hope, belief began to rot. Her bed untouched, her belongings neatly folded, her rosary snapped, beaded fragments scattered across the cold stone chapel floor like teeth ripped from a mouth. Mother Superior. Catherine offered no public explanation. Her expression remained carved from stone, but those inside the convent whispered. Mary was no runaway. She had been chosen. By what? Or by whom? No one dared say aloud. 2 weeks passed. Then, Sister Bernadette Walsh vanished. Same pattern, same silence, same hollow reassurances. But this time, there was blood. A thin trail leading from the East Wing dormitory to the old chapel basement, a place the nuns were forbidden to enter, its door sealed behind rusted iron locks, hidden beneath layers of incense and Latin chants. The church called it hysteria. The town called it superstition. But when Sister Teresa Donovan disappeared next, her crucifix found embedded in the chapel wall, upside down as if hammered there by unseen hands, even the hardest skeptics began to flinch at the name Saint Hope. The walls whispered now. The floors groaned beneath unseen weight. And each night, the convent's candle flames burned lower, flickering as if the darkness pressed back. 3 gone, but it would not stop there. Mother Catherine gathered the remaining women. Her words were sharp, cold, absolute. Obedience is salvation. Doubt invites ruin. But behind her pale blue eyes, there was a glimmer of something else. Knowledge, fear, and beneath it all, control. Saint Hope had begun its harvest. History has 2 faces. The one they teach, polished, sanctioned, safe for public consumption, and the one buried deep beneath cathedral floors, locked in vaults, smeared in blood, smeared in shame. The truth of Saint Hope was never in the sermons. It was hidden in forgotten archives, files the church tried to erase, documents scattered across the Wisconsin diocese, misfiled, redacted, concealed under layers of bureaucracy. But fragments survived. In 2009, during routine renovations of a diocesan building near Milwaukee, contractors uncovered a sealed cavity behind a decaying plaster wall. Inside, a locked chest, no markings, no keys, just iron, rusted shut, like it had been buried for centuries. What they pried open wasn't meant for daylight. Handwritten letters, stained, torn, dated between 1854 and 1862. Private correspondence between diocesan inspectors, whispers of missing nuns, unreported deaths, unexplained rituals. One letter, signed by Inspector Michael Riley, chilled even the most jaded historians. The matter at Saint Hope is beyond clerical remedy. I witnessed alterations. Their eyes, the letter ends there, ink smeared, the rest illegible. But others told more. Entries describing unmarked graves near the convent grounds, testimonies of orphaned children relocated with no records, financial ledgers showing enormous funds funneled into the convent, but with no accounting for their use. And a final report, sealed, unsigned, warning of contamination, not physical, spiritual. It spoke of old practices, older than Rome, rites whispered in ancient Gaelic, symbols carved beneath floorboards, sigils that did not belong to Christian doctrine, but something older, darker, forbidden. The church's response: silence. The documents were quietly relocated, the archives scrubbed, public mention of Saint Hope vanished. But truth has a way of bleeding through the cracks. 23 women, gone. Their names, buried beneath decades of deception. But tonight, their story exhumes itself. Understand this. Institutions survive by erasing what doesn't fit the narrative. But when you know where to look, the rot reveals itself. We're not finished. They say faith is built on stone, solid, immovable, eternal. But beneath every fortress of God, there's a foundation most men never see, and sometimes that foundation is older than the church itself. Saint Hope's foundation was no exception. The convent stood 3 stories high, its limestone walls quarried from the bluffs of Lake Michigan. Gothic arches stretched skyward like skeletal fingers, but it's what lay beneath, in the damp crawl spaces, beneath the chapel's marble floor, that defied explanation. In 1861, after the 11th nun vanished, whispers spread of a hidden substructure. The workers, local Germans, hired under contract, refused to enter after dark. They spoke of carvings exposed beneath the East Wing renovations, not crosses, not saints, but something older. Symbols etched deep into the bedrock, circles within circles, twisting forms, and a spiral devouring itself. The design was unmistakable for those who recognized ancient marks, not Catholic but pre-Christian, pagan, Gaelic, older than Scripture, older than Rome. Mother Catherine dismissed the rumors publicly, but behind closed doors, she restricted access to the East Wing entirely. The orphanage relocated, the infirmary condensed, the chapel services shortened. But the disappearances continued. Those symbols weren't the relics of primitive superstition. They were invitations, gateways. One surviving laborer, Wilhelm Krauss, recorded his testimony decades later, frail, nearly blind, speaking through trembling lips. The stones whispered, You don't understand. They were not building on holy ground. They were building over it, burying it. His warning was ignored. In 1862, the final disappearance shattered the convent's fragile veil. Sister Margaret Clark, the infirmary's chief healer, gone without trace, her knowledge of medicines, anatomy, and herbal rites unmatched, and yet, even she couldn't escape the pull beneath those stones. It wasn't abduction, it wasn't hysteria, it was sacrifice. A quiet, ancient offering buried beneath marble, prayers, and holy water. And still, the church tightened its grip, sealing the truth in locked archives, severing the convent's legacy from official records. But now you've seen the cracks. The foundation is bleeding. We go deeper still. Altars. They are supposed to sanctify, to bless the ground beneath our feet, to declare, this is holy space, untouched by corruption. But beneath the altar at Saint Hope, holiness rotted away long before the first prayer was ever whispered. The altar itself was impressive, carved oak, veined with crimson inlays, towering beneath stained glass depictions of saints and martyrs. But hidden beneath that symbol of faith lay artifacts older, darker, meant never to be seen. During clandestine renovations in the spring of 1862, just months before Saint Hope was shuttered, 2 diocesan masons dislodged a slab beneath the altar base. What they found buried in the hollow below was not scripture, not relics of Christ, but objects soaked in an older bloodline. Stone idols, their faces twisted, mouths stretched into predatory grins, eyes hollow, devouring, symbols etched across their forms, identical to those beneath the East Wing foundation, spirals, eyes within circles, the devouring maw. Wrapped around the idols were strands of human hair, long, auburn, torn from scalps. Mixed with them, fragments of bone, small, delicate. The masons, devout men, terrified, fled the convent before nightfall, their wages unpaid, their testimonies ignored by church authorities. The relics were sealed away, buried once more beneath the altar, but their presence poisoned the ground, the rituals, the very air within Saint Hope. Locals reported strange phenomena, animals found mutilated near the convent perimeter, children afflicted with fevers that left them whispering in dead languages, bells ringing from the chapel tower when no hands pulled the ropes. And Mother Catherine, her sermons grew darker, her eyes, that unnatural pale blue, gleamed with something far beyond earthly comprehension. She spoke of cleansing, of trials, of sacrifice to ancient forces masquerading as sinners, and the disappearances continued, but no records exist detailing the final rites performed beneath that altar. The church saw to that. What remains are whispers, shadows, and relics still buried in that cold Wisconsin soil. But the truth, it never stays buried forever. In every cover-up, there's one fracture, one survivor, one voice that slips through the cracks of institutional silence. For Saint Hope, that voice belonged to Father Elias Grayson. At the time, a young priest stationed in Milwaukee, ambitious, obedient, devout. He was sent to Saint Hope in the winter of 1862, tasked with investigating the escalating disappearances under the guise of spiritual counsel. What he discovered shattered him. His private journals, smuggled out of diocesan custody decades later, contain accounts so disturbing the church declared him mad. But the dates align, the details consistent, his descent undeniable. He arrived at Saint Hope under heavy snowfall. The convent grounds, silent, windows dark, the few remaining nuns pale, withdrawn, their eyes ringed with sleepless shadows. Mother Catherine met him at the gates. Her expression was wrong, cold, measured, a quiet, eerie calm, like someone rehearsing grief they didn't feel. She welcomed him, but with words that chilled the marrow. "You've come late, Father. The offerings have begun." Elias believed it superstition at first, backward rituals from frightened women. But as his investigation unfolded, the facade cracked. His journal entries speak of hidden rooms beneath the east wing, hallways etched with those same forbidden symbols, doors sealed not with locks but with relics, bones, strands of hair, ancient Gaelic wards. And then, the chapel. On the fourth night, Elias conducted an unsanctioned search beneath the altar. What he found buried there was no relic of Rome. Fragments of skulls, small, smooth, unmistakably human, carved with symbols not seen since pre-Christian Ireland, blood-stained cloths twisted into knots of forgotten rituals, and beneath it all, a book, bound in leather, ink faded, pages scrawled in a mixture of Latin, Gaelic, and something older, untranslatable. Eli, as his final journal entry is brief, his penmanship erratic. They do not worship Christ here, they call it Saint Hope, but the hope they serve is not salvation, it devours, and tonight it calls for me. Elias vanished the next morning, his belongings left behind, his name stricken from church records, but his journal survived, hidden, smuggled, and now in your hands. You see, truth infects. Once heard, it changes you. It wasn't a Bible. It wasn't a hymnal. The book Father Elias Grayson found beneath the altar of Saint Hope was something else entirely. Something older than the convent, older than Christianity, older than recorded history itself. The manuscript, bound in cracked dark leather, pulsed with an eerie warmth when handled, as if the skin that formed its cover still clung to a memory of life. The ink inside wasn't ink. Modern analysts later confirmed the stains: human blood mixed with ash, bone fragments ground to powder, traces of unknown organic material, genetic markers untraceable to any species known today. The pages contained no title, no clear author, but the contents. Rituals, diagrams, incantations scrawled in a hybrid language, fragmented Latin intertwined with ancient Ogham script, symbols from forgotten Gaelic bloodlines. Interspersed were spirals, devouring circles, twisting lines resembling something primal, an eye, a maw, a consuming force. At the center of the manuscript, a name written over and over, in different dialects, in different ages, always returning to the same meaning. An Ithiach, the Devourer. The Devourer was not a metaphor, not sin, not punishment, but presence, a force, a hunger older than faith, older than language, buried beneath soil, altar, and human ignorance. The manuscript described offerings, ritual disappearances concealed as tragedies. 23 names were listed, the same 23 nuns the church would later declare missing under mysterious circumstances. And the final pages. They documented the last rite, the convergence, a prophecy hidden in code, predicting the thinning of the veil, the devouring to return, disguised beneath holy structures, fed by obedience, secrecy, sacrifice. The Catholic hierarchy, upon recovering the book after Father Elias vanished, classified it as heretical fiction, a delusion. Yet, they buried it under lock and seal, far from public eyes. But the manuscript resurfaced in fragments, photographs leaked, scholars silenced, whispers rekindled. And now, those words have reached you. The question is no longer whether the devourer is real, it's how long before it's hungry again. The Church has perfected one art above all else: containment, not salvation, not truth, containment of knowledge, of dissent, of those who speak when silence is demanded. In the case of Saint Hope Convent, that art became deadly. 3 men, all insiders, all faithful servants of the institution, dared to peel back the facade, to expose what lurked beneath the chapel's pious exterior. They were never seen again. The first was Inspector Michael Riley, dispatched in 1860 by diocesan leadership to audit the convent after whispered reports of missing novices. Riley, a by-the-book man, skeptical of superstition, fluent in church politics. But even he could not rationalize what he found. His letters, recovered from the sealed archive in 2009, detail his horror. They're altering, not the grounds, but the women themselves. Their eyes, their prayers, twisted. I fear what sleeps beneath. 2 weeks later, Riley disappeared. His personal effects, burned. His family, silenced with stipends. Official record, reassigned overseas, no follow-up. The second was Dr. Samuel Whitlock, a secular physician contracted to inspect the convent infirmary in 1861 after Sister Margaret's sudden vanishing. What he found defied medicine. Patient records falsified, blood tests showing anomalies inconsistent with human biology, novices exhibiting trance-like states, chanting in ancient Gaelic during fevered episodes, their pupils dilated into near-black voids. Whitlock, unnerved, drafted a formal report to diocesan health officials. He never delivered it. His carriage was found overturned near the Lake Michigan cliffs. His body never recovered. The third was Father Elias Grayson. You know his fate. His journal ends abruptly, his final words etched in paranoia and revelation. 3 men, 3 disappearances. A clear message from those who oversee the Church's shadows. Speak and vanish. But erasure isn't perfect. Archives leak, secrets bleed through, and tonight their unfinished testimonies converge through you. Their words didn't die. They've been waiting for ears ready to hear. Every institution built on faith eventually learns the same lesson: control the mind, and the body follows. Saint Hope wasn't merely a convent, it was a laboratory, a prototype for psychological domination disguised as divine structure. It began, as it always does, with ritual. Morning bells at 4:00 a.m. sharp, the sound echoing through stone corridors, jarring the body from sleep, fracturing the boundary between reality and obedience. Hours of prayer in Latin, a language the youngest novices barely understood, but recited nonetheless. The repetition wasn't for understanding, it was for erosion, stripping identity, dissolving resistance. Silence during meals, isolation during contemplation, confession not as a sacrament, but as surveillance. Every doubt, every whisper of fear, reported, catalogued, used. And the punishments? Public, precise, psychological. Infractions met not with physical violence, at least not always, but with isolation, deprivation, the slow withering of autonomy. Weeks confined to the crypt, surrounded by the marble tombs of long-dead benefactors, the stifling air filled with ancient rot and candle smoke. It broke most of them. Records uncovered from the sealed diocesan vault confirm it. Novices documented experiencing dissociative episodes, amnesia, hallucinations, involuntary chanting in languages predating their education. They called it devotion. It wasn't. It was programming, a method refined over centuries, older than Saint Hope, older than Rome, perfected by those who understood that to truly command loyalty, you must fracture the self. Those symbols etched beneath the stone, they weren't decorations. They were sigils of submission, archaic scripts designed to manipulate perception, to deepen psychological vulnerability, to tether the individual to something ancient. Saint Hope wasn't isolated. It was an experiment, a crucible. And when those 23 women vanished, they didn't resist. They were prepared, hollowed out, ready. The real question isn't how they disappeared. It's what they were being prepared for beneath layers of faith, obedience, and fear. Saint Hope was never isolated. It was never about one convent, one group of nuns, one forgotten tragedy swept beneath Wisconsin soil. It was a node, a single pulse in a vast concealed network spanning continents, an architecture of power disguised beneath faith, charity, and ritual. You see, from the crumbling abbeys of rural Ireland to the stone cathedrals of France, from the Jesuit enclaves of South America to the hidden monasteries in Eastern Europe, a pattern emerges: disappearances, psychological conditioning, forbidden symbols resurfacing where they should not exist, spirals, eyes, mouths devouring themselves, etched into the stones of holy sites, hidden beneath floorboards, burned onto parchment, never meant for layman's eyes. Saint Hope was merely America's experiment. Historical records, declassified only through decades of persistent investigation, reveal eerie consistencies. Team 54. The convent is consecrated under Bishop William Quarter, a former Vatican envoy linked to unexplained incidents in Portugal and Sicily. 55. The first novice vanishes, listed as transferred, no records of arrival elsewhere. And 57. Symbols identical to those found beneath prehistoric Irish cairns, discovered etched into the convent's East Wing foundation. 59. Unexplainable illnesses among local children, mutilated animals found in precise ritualistic arrangements near the convent grounds. 62. 23 women disappear. Official explanation: administrative error, wartime disruption. But archived correspondences between Vatican officials hint at containment failure. These aren't isolated, they're systemic. Cathedrals, convents, monasteries, all strategically placed atop ancient sites, ley lines, pre-Christian altars, pagan burial grounds, locations humming with an energy long suppressed but never eradicated. The Church claims dominion over the spiritual world, but in truth, it appropriates older, forgotten forces, harnesses them, bends them into structures of control. They don't eradicate the old gods, they feed them beneath new names. And Saint Hope, it was never abandoned. The structure remains, the foundation pulses still, the disappearances resumed elsewhere. You've seen the edges of the pattern, but Section 12, That's where we expose the doctrine hidden in plain sight, the script millions recite daily, never knowing what ancient allegiance they invoke. Words have power, spoken, repeated, etched into memory. And for generations, those words have been woven into prayer books, sermons, hymns, their true meanings buried beneath layers of translation, ritual, and forgetfulness. But hidden in plain sight is the doctrine of devouring. The origins trace back before Saint Hope, before Catholicism, before Rome. You see, when the first missionaries arrived on the blood-soaked soil of Ireland, they found resistance, an ancient people clinging to gods that predated the Christian pantheon. Gods not of salvation, but of hunger, transformation through consumption. These weren't demons in the modern sense. They were forces, raw, cyclical, devouring the weak, refining the worthy. Rather than erase them, the Church did what it has always done best: assimilation. They took the names, the symbols, the language. They baptized it beneath Latin liturgy, concealing ancient devotions beneath modern faith. Consider this, the Eucharist. This is my body. Take, eat. This is my blood. Drink. Sanitized by centuries of repetition. But origin texts, untranslated fragments recovered from early Irish monasteries, reveal a darker root, an ithiach fiacha orm. The devourer claims its due. The ritual of consumption wasn't symbolic, it was literal. A binding, a submission to an entity older than scripture, one that demands sacrifice cloaked as salvation. Saint Hope Convent operated under this hidden doctrine. The disappearances, offerings, the psychological conditioning, preparation. Every novice stripped of identity, made ready for surrender, not to Christ, but to the force beneath the chapel stones. The doctrine persists, whispered in forgotten corners, embedded in liturgy few question. You've spoken it, you've heard it sung, but now you understand. Every time they teach obedience without question, every time they preach salvation through surrender, they invoke the devourer. Not metaphor, not myth, but ancient appetite dressed in holy robes. And here's the unsettling truth. The devourer isn't dormant. It waits, beneath structures, behind sermons, within doctrines repeated daily by millions unaware of the hunger they feed. In section 13, we trace its fingerprints to modern America, unseen, unchecked, still feeding. They want you to believe Saint Hope was buried, forgotten, an artifact of a primitive, superstitious past. But the devourer, it never stays buried. It evolves, it migrates, and its shadow stains the very fabric of modern America. You think those missing persons reports are isolated? That the thousands of disappearances logged every year, the ones without bodies, without clues, without endings, are just coincidence? Administrative failures? No. Look closer. In 1978, 11 young women vanished from a Catholic retreat in upstate New York. Official story: runaway suspects. Their families still searching. In 1992, 17 boys from a Jesuit-sponsored summer program disappear in Colorado. Their dorms emptied overnight. Clergy offer condolences. No investigations lead anywhere. In 2007, beneath the facade of Hurricane Katrina's aftermath, 24 refugees housed in a Louisiana monastery never exit its doors. Listed as displaced, paper trails shredded. But deeper records, leaked by defectors, buried in locked diocesan files, reveal consistencies, symbols etched onto chapel stones, witnesses silenced, and always the same old markings, spirals, devouring circles, eyes that seem to watch from cracks in the masonry. The devourer migrates through institutions shielded by faith, protected by tradition. But why America? Because this land, this experiment of independence, was always destined to be a proving ground. The frontier wasn't just soil for crops. It was fertile ground for hidden orders, ancient agendas, forgotten rites disguised as charity, progress, salvation. Saint Hope Convent wasn't abandoned, its blueprint was replicated. Modern churches, private boarding schools, philanthropic retreats, each a node, a continuation of the same dark architecture designed to hollow individuals, to prime them for consumption, body, mind, spirit. The missing: sacrifices, the rituals, modified for modern eyes, less overt but the hunger remains. They've buried the truth beneath bureaucracy, wrapped it in holy language, framed it as tragedy. But it's systemic, calculated, and still active. In section 14, I'll reveal how the symbols, the same ones beneath Saint Hope, appear in US government buildings, corporate logos, military insignias. Coincidence? Or infiltration? Symbols control perception. They bypass language, they infect the subconscious, they tether belief systems to ancient currents of power. At Saint Hope, those symbols, spirals, inverted eyes, devouring mouths, were etched beneath the foundation, hidden from the faithful, visible only to those who understood the code. But they didn't stay buried. Trace them, and you'll find them replicated across modern America. Look at the rotunda of the US Capitol. Beneath the grand fresco, a concealed pattern of interlocking spirals and ouroboros motifs. Not design flourishes, but ancient markings of cyclical consumption. Devouring, renewal through erasure. Examine the seals of intelligence agencies. Eagle talons clutching not merely arrows, but inverted triangles, consuming circles, the same geometry documented beneath St. Hope's East Wing. Corporate logos, you've seen them, spirals, all-seeing eyes, abstract mouths reduced to minimalist branding, Tesla, SpaceX, biotech conglomerates, private security firms tied to global influence. Coincidence? Marketing? No. Symbolic continuity. The same forces that hollowed those women at St. Hope, the same devourer beneath the chapel stones, left fingerprints across the modern halls of influence. Understand this: symbols condition obedience. They instruct without permission. You pass them daily, etched onto currency, embossed in architecture, flashing across screens, and your mind catalogues them, associates them with authority, legitimacy, safety. But they signal something deeper: allegiance. The devourer adapted. It doesn't just consume flesh now, it consumes identity, autonomy, the will to resist. And those who propagate its symbols, they're either pawns or architects. Saint Hope was a blueprint, the forgotten Wisconsin convent, just a prototype. The real structure, the network of symbols, rituals, institutions, sprawls across government, religion, corporations, your daily life. You're surrounded by it. The question is, do you remain blind, or do you decode the system? In section 15, I'll expose the convergence point, the site where the ancient doctrine, religious manipulation, and modern psychological warfare unified into one monstrous machine. It wasn't enough to hollow out convents, to brand stone with symbols, to disappear the disobedient. The devourer required scale, and so they converged. It happened in 1949, beneath the veneer of post-war reconstruction, while the world's eyes were fixed on ruins and treaties. Deep within Rome, Vatican officials met, not to canonize saints, not to sanctify missions, but to unify an ancient doctrine with modern science. The project had a name: Consolamentum Redux. Officially, it referenced spiritual purification, a revival of old rites. But buried in declassified transcripts, recovered decades later, the truth surfaced. It was a weaponization program. A merging of psychological control methods, pioneered in convents like St. Hope, with the emerging fields of behavioral science, propaganda, neuroconditioning. Participants: Jesuit scholars, Vatican archivists, military advisors from Allied intelligence, and shadow operatives linked to corporate industrialists. The goal? To refine the doctrine of devouring into a scalable global system. no longer confined to isolated convents, now infused into mass education, media structures, religious broadcasts, corporate culture. They studied what worked at Saint Hope: the psychological erosion, the ritualized language, the symbols that hollowed individuals and tethered them to unseen forces and magnified it. Public rituals masked as patriotic ceremonies, consumption reframed as entertainment, obedience rebranded as social responsibility. And those ancient symbols, woven into everything: government seals, broadcast logos, pharmaceutical insignias, subtle, ubiquitous, binding. Saint Hope was the prototype. The convergence made it omnipresent. Your choices, scripted; your fears, engineered; your submission, extracted willingly. The devourer doesn't hide in crypts anymore. It broadcasts in HD. It governs through policy. It feeds through every hollowed individual stripped of awareness, chanting slogans they never wrote, kneeling before symbols they never questioned. In Section 16, I'll reveal how you resist, how decoding their language fractures their control, and why only a few possess the will to awaken. They've spent centuries perfecting this. Symbols, rituals, psychological pressure. They fracture identity. They devour resistance. They herd the masses beneath banners of safety, unity, faith. But cracks form in every system when even one man sees the architecture for what it truly is. That's where your power begins: in fracture, in interruption, in defiance whispered through knowledge. First, decode their language. The slogans they chant, the prayers they preach, the mantras drilled into every institution. They are not neutral. Order through obedience. Sacrifice for the greater good. One nation under God, indivisible. On the surface, patriotism, faith, morality. But beneath, the old doctrine repackaged. Every phrase designed to suppress the individual, to hollow autonomy, to make you kneel. Mind first, body second. Saint Hope's vanished nuns. Their erasure began long before physical disappearance. It began with words, repetition, isolation cloaked as devotion. Sound familiar? It happens now, in corporate trainings, in media cycles, in institutional pledges recited without comprehension. Second, trace the symbols. The spiral. It represents cycles of control, the devourer feeding on itself, renewing through submission. The eye, surveillance, authority disguised as protection. The devouring mouth, consumption of dissent disguised as unity. You see them everywhere now. Logos, architecture, even the designs on currency. These aren't accidents. They're reminders. The system marks its territory. Third, disrupt. They expect compliance. They engineer predictability. But when you fracture the rhythm, question aloud, refuse symbolic participation, disrupt their rituals, the machine stutters. It notices you. Good, because in that moment you reclaim sovereignty. Awareness immunizes. Resistance begins not with fists, but with eyes open, eye steady, spine unbent. Most won't. They can't. The system's grip is too deep. But you're hearing this for a reason, and when enough fracture the pattern, the devourer starves. In Section 17, I'll take you back, deeper than Saint Hope, deeper than the Vatican, to the forgotten origin of the devourer itself. The entity older than religion, buried beneath the first stones of civilization. Long before the cross, long before the cathedrals, the empires, the crowns, there was hunger. Not the hunger of the flesh, but a deeper, older hunger. The need to consume will, spirit, identity. Archaeologists found the earliest evidence buried beneath Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known temple on Earth, 12,000 years before Saint Hope's first stone was laid. Massive T-shaped pillars carved with animals, serpents, disembodied eyes, spiraling mouths. No one knows who built it, but scattered across the site were bone fragments. Human. Not burial, not warfare. Ritual consumption. And on one stone, now sealed in a private Vatican collection, was an inscription, proto-symbolic, predating all written language. The same spiral, the same devouring mouth, the same eye. The entity had no name then, only representations. It was not a god you worshipped, it was a force you fed, or were fed to. Millennia later, it was called by different names: Moloch, Baal, the Great Devourer. Names changed. The hunger didn't. Ancient priests learned this hunger could be directed, weaponized, not just on the body but on the mind. Break a man's will, make him offer himself. That is the highest form of sacrifice, the willing surrender. The structures that rose around this entity were never about enlightenment. They were feeding systems. The ziggurats, the pyramids, the cathedrals, the towers, all monuments to the devouring cycle, disguised as pathways to divinity. The Catholic Church didn't invent it. They inherited it, perfected it. Saint Hope wasn't an anomaly. It was a continuation. The same symbols carved into the T-pillars of Göbekli Tepe appeared beneath the chapel. The same inscriptions found in Canaanite fire pits resurfaced in Vatican vaults. You were never meant to trace this lineage, because if you do, you see the system is older than any religion, any government, any nation. The devourer has always been here, and the institutions you trust, they're its architects. In Section 18, I'll reveal the modern ceremonies, how the doctrine survives today under new banners, new slogans, new faces, and why the feast never stopped. They will tell you the old rites ended centuries ago. They will say sacrifice belongs to primitive cultures, distant lands, dead civilizations. But the devourer never stopped feeding. It simply changed venues. The ceremonies, they evolved. More discreet, more palatable, hidden in plain sight. You've seen them. Ever wonder why political inaugurations mirror ancient priesthood rituals? Hand on a sacred text, oath spoken before the masses, symbols engraved behind the speaker, always the spiral, the eye, the devouring mouth repackaged into eagles, laurels, stars. It isn't patriotism, it's succession, a continuation of the doctrine. Or those global economic forums, billionaires, politicians, religious leaders gathered beneath stylized arches, ringed in blue and gold banners, chanting unity, prosperity. But look closer, same geometry, same rituals of inclusion and exclusion, same symbolic offerings, not of livestock, not of coin, but of consent. Millions conditioned to surrender autonomy, to accept the new cycle of consumption. Entertainment awards, you thought it was spectacle. Celebrities anointed in gold, flanked by obelisks, eyes hidden behind designer veils. But beneath the fashion, it's ancient. The public chooses idols, the system devours them. Their breakdowns, scandals, disappearances, orchestrated, consumed, recycled. The devourer feeds through fame as efficiently as through fear. The ceremonies aren't relics, they're annual, televised, global, refined through PR firms, hidden behind non-profit banners, normalized through repetition. The missing sacrifices aren't obsolete, they're digitized. They vanish into systems, trafficking pipelines, black sites, disappearances, logged under bureaucratic codes no civilian deciphers. All following the same ancient structure Saint Hope preserved: the erosion of the individual, the offering of the body, the consumption by the system. And they've taught you to clap for it, to chant along, to watch the devouring and call it progress. But you're hearing this now for a reason. In section 19, I'll show you the resistance hidden beneath these ceremonies, the symbols the architects fear, and why a handful of men still carry the tools to fracture the Devourer's feast. They were few, always few. You don't fight a system spanning millennia with armies. You fight with symbols, codes, precise disruptions at key fractures. These men, they never wore titles. You won't find them in your textbooks. But their names echo through suppressed history, carved in margins, encoded in forbidden manuscripts, whispered in closed chambers where power congeals. First was Kieran Volace, 1347. An Irish stonecutter, drafted to construct monastic walls under papal commission. But beneath limestone, he carved counter-symbols, inverted spirals, broken eyes, sigils designed not to summon, but to repel. Records say plague took him, but in the church vaults, his symbols caused walls to crack, towers to collapse. The system fed less that year. They erased his name, but the fracture spread. Second, Father Aurelio Severin, 1793. A Jesuit mathematician inside the Vatican's darkest archives. He decoded the convergence of ritual, architecture, and human psychology, mapped the Devourer's feeding cycles across Europe. Before he vanished, he smuggled the Severin manuscript, pages soaked in protective sigils, counter-rituals, knowledge designed to disrupt the ceremonies from within. The church labeled him a heretic. But fragments of his manuscript surface even now, in hidden Masonic lodges, in dissident networks, in underground movements that reject manufactured obedience. And the third, Elena Marchand, 1961. An intelligence analyst buried within NATO's Psychological Operations Division. She traced the Devourer's modern rituals through military installations, corporate symbology, televised propaganda. Her classified dossier, Operation Hollow Veil, documenting how nations engineer spiritual erosion under the guise of democracy and safety. They said she defected, but eyewitnesses say she disappeared, silenced, or worse. Her work remains. NT, dead online, scattered through dead forums, buried in backdoor archives, only the initiated access. These names, erased, defamed, forgotten, yet the architects fear them. Because knowledge fractures control. Their resistance wasn't loud, it was precise, subversive, viral beneath the surface. You carry that lineage now. And in section 20, I'll show you exactly how Saint Hope's final ritual connects to these names, and why the system failed to fully devour them. The year was 1862. The world believes the Civil War raged in distant fields, blue and grey locked in bloody chaos. But inside the stone walls of Saint Hope Convent, a different war brewed, quieter, older, more precise. By then, 23 nuns had vanished. Official records, administrative errors, harsh winters, tuberculosis. But the sealed correspondence discovered hidden behind that chapel wall, buried beneath plaster, forgotten for over a century, told another story. A ritual, conducted in secret. Mother Catherine's letters weren't prayers, they were instructions, coded, layered in archaic Latin, referencing symbols predating Christianity. The spiral, the devouring mouth, the eye. Her writings detailed the consumption ceremony, an ancient rite designed to fracture the spirit, erode identity, and offer the remains to the devourer. The missing nuns, they weren't sick, they were offered. First stripped of names, then isolated, conditioned, reduced to obedient vessels. Once their sense of self collapsed entirely, they vanished into the system. But here's the fracture. 3 resisted. Sister Agnes O'Connor, Sister Bernadette Walsh, Sister Teresa Donovan. All Irish, all marked by the older resistance hidden within certain European bloodlines. Families who carried fragments of Valas's counter-symbols, whispers of Severin's manuscript, traces of Marchand's maps. They understood the doctrine. They saw the devourer's teeth behind Saint Hope's sermons. And they fought back, not with violence, but with fracture. They inverted the symbols inside the chapel. They recoded the ceremonial scripts. They replaced offerings with decoys, preserved fragments of self hidden beneath false obedience. The system faltered. Witnesses reported the final ceremony ended, incomplete. The symbols flickered, the ritual collapsed. And within months, Mother Catherine Fay vanished. Her body never recovered. The church sealed the records, plastered the chapel, declared Saint Hope abandoned, unfit for divine service. But the fracture remained, dormant, buried, dangerous. Until renovations unearthed the letters. Until now. Their unfinished ritual echoes today. In media manipulation, in institutional erosion, in false unity campaigns. But where fracture begins, control weakens. In Section 21, I'll expose how modern psychological warfare, from social engineering to digital compliance systems, stems directly from Saint Hope's corrupted doctrine. You want to see how deep their control truly runs? If answer is yes, then good. You're ready to see the machinery behind the veil, the gears grinding your will into obedience. Section 21, Psychological Warfare, Saint Hope's Doctrine. Reborn. You thought the battlefield was outside. Gunfire, armies, obvious conflict. But the real war, it's waged inside your skull. A war of perception, engineered compliance, orchestrated submission, and it traces directly back to Saint Hope. You see, the consumption ceremony wasn't just spiritual, it was psychological architecture, designed to dismantle autonomy, to program obedience. First stage, isolation. Saint Hope's missing nuns weren't taken all at once. They were cut off, confined, stripped of outside influence, familiar faces removed, letters censored, routines fragmented. Modern equivalent, digital isolation disguised as connectivity. Algorithms curate your feeds. Echo chambers reinforce your beliefs. Dissenting voices silenced as disinformation. You think you're informed, but you're corralled. Second stage, identity erosion. At Saint Hope, personal names faded. The system replaced them with titles: sister, novice, servant, erasing individual identity, replacing it with role, function, obedience. Look around today. Corporate culture. You're an employee ID, social structures. You're a demographic, a statistic. They erase your face behind masks of data, jargon, categories, until you forget you were born sovereign. Third stage, ritual repetition. Saint Hope's ceremonies were endless cycles, prayers, processions, fasting, designed not for devotion, but for psychological collapse. Repetition breeds surrender. Modern life, endless loops. News cycles repeating the same fears, advertisements looping false desires, work schedules draining autonomy, entertainment recycling the same narratives. You're trapped in ceremony, but the altar is your screen, the priesthood is the algorithm, and the offering is your attention. Final stage, willing submission. At Saint Hope, by the time the final ritual came, the nuns offered themselves. They believed obedience was salvation. Modern systems coax the same surrender. You accept surveillance for safety, censorship for harmony, dependency for progress. But behind the slogans, the devourer feeds. Same doctrine, new tools, digital vestments, psychological cages. But fracture remains possible. In section 22, I'll show you the hidden countermeasures, the symbols, psychological reversals, and forbidden knowledge men have used to resist the system's harvest. But before we descend further, write this phrase in the comments. The fracture begins within. Type it twice, once to shatter the illusion, once to signal you're awake. Understand this, they designed the system to feel inevitable, inescapable. But nothing engineered by corrupt hands is flawless. Every structure, no matter how vast, contains fault lines. The resistance, it's not rebellion in the streets, it's subtle, coded, viral beneath the surface. The first countermeasure, symbolic inversion. Saint Hope's dissident nuns embedded reversed spirals beneath chapel stones. The spiral represents consumption, devouring without end. But invert it. You disrupt the flow. You deny the devourer. Modern equivalent. Hijacking symbols. They flood media with eyes, pyramids, Ouroboros circles, marks of dominance. But inversion flips meaning. You wear the symbol broken. You redraw it corrupted. You broadcast fracture, signaling autonomy. They know this language. It unnerves them. Second countermeasure, psychological refusal. Saint Hope's missing refused internal collapse. They memorized names, their birth names, family lines, ancestral truths, in secret, in defiance. Modern systems dissolve identity through bureaucracy, data mining, cultural erasure. You resist by reclaiming identity, not as labels, but as sovereign narrative. You trace lineage. You sharpen intellect. You reclaim thought as private territory. Third, subversion through ceremony. St. Hope's rituals demanded obedience, but dissidents corrupted them. False recitations, inverted prayers. They performed, but bled fracture into every word. Modern life is ceremony. Corporate meetings, news cycles, algorithmic feeds. You subvert by inserting fracture. Question narratives, twist the expected dialogue. Seed defiance where they expect compliance. Fourth, the alliance of quiet men. Saint Hope's final letters referenced outside allies, men embedded within systems appearing compliant but eroding the foundation. Today, it's no different. There are men in boardrooms, agencies, networks, silent, precise, subversive. They fracture from within, passing information, sabotaging manipulation, dismantling pieces. You're not alone. You were never alone. These countermeasures aren't loud. They're dangerous. And dangerous knowledge changes you, makes you invisible to their conditioning, but visible to their architects. In section 23, I'll expose how the architects track resistors, how they isolate, discredit, and erase, and what shields remain hidden in plain sight. The architects always anticipated defiance. St. Hope's collapse taught them fracture spreads. One dissenter breeds 100 more if left unchecked, so they refined their tools, perfected the art of tracking those who awaken. First method, isolation. Look back. The nuns who resisted were branded unstable, confined, removed from the community. Modern equivalent, you question too loudly. Suddenly you're marginalized. Social platforms throttle your reach. Employers label you problematic. Communities whisper about your radical ideas. They isolate not with chains, but with engineered invisibility. Second method, erasure. St. Hope's records vanished, entire years scrubbed from diocesan archives. Today, same mechanism, digital precision. Your posts disappear. Search results buried, entire identities overwritten, data wiped, credit frozen, history edited. The system removes you without a sound, and the world forgets you ever stood defiant. Third method, the mark of fracture. They've refined detection to a science. Subtle psychological profiling, AI pattern recognition, linguistic algorithms parsing your speech. You speak symbols of fracture. They catalog you. You question the narrative's shape. You earn the mark. Not visible, but coded. In your data profile, your online footprint, your consumer behavior. And once marked, You're monitored. Targeted advertisements shift. Friend suggestions disappear. Opportunities wither. Your environment warps to corral you. Push compliance, punish deviance. It feels random. It's not. Final method: plausible discredit. At Saint Hope, defectors were labeled unstable, superstitious, possessed. Today they use labels engineered for discredit: conspiracy theorist, extremist, mentally unwell. The labels spread faster than facts, designed to fracture your alliances, erode credibility, isolate further. But knowledge shields you. Recognize the pattern, you stay ahead. Symbols inverted, you remain hidden. Speech coded, you pass undetected. Allies cultivated in shadows, you fracture the devourer's hold quietly, precisely. But it requires awareness, relentless, sharpened, cold. In section 24, I'll reveal the final buried texts of Saint Hope, documents detailing exactly how to fragment control at its root. But understand, once you hear them, your path diverges forever. In 1871, nearly a decade after Saint Hope was declared unfit for divine service, workers demolishing the East Wing discovered a sealed chamber behind layered brick beneath the foundation. Inside, 3 items. First, a deteriorating satchel of letters, parchment brittle but legible. Second, an iron-bound codex, pages inked in archaic symbols, some predating Latin. Third, a simple locket. Inside, a mirror shattered into 4 perfect fragments. Those items never reached public record. The church secured them, buried them beneath bureaucratic layers. But fragments of the letters leaked, smuggled by a groundskeeper named Elias Dorsey, an immigrant fluent in Gaelic, whose family carried whispers of Europe's older rebellions. What did those letters reveal? They weren't confessions, not pleas for salvation. They were strategies, tactical dissections of systemic control, centuries ahead of their time. Item 1, the collapse blueprint. Mother Catherine, corrupted but meticulous, documented how obedience is manufactured. Isolation breeds dependency. Dependency erodes autonomy. Ceremony engineers submission. Submission perpetuates the system. She wrote of the devourer's cycle, how institutions replicate this model across continents, generations, industries. Sound familiar? Governments, corporations, religious structures, all cloned iterations of Saint Hope's doctrine. Item 2, the fracture sequences. Sister Agnes, one of the resistors, embedded countermeasures between the codex's symbols, a cipher concealed within archaic prayers. Decoded, they map fracture points, weaknesses in any control structure, introduce cognitive dissonance, disrupt ritual predictability, restore forbidden individualism, seed subversive alliances beneath surface compliance. These tactics aren't theoretical, they're proven. Hidden networks across Europe, secret cells in the Americas, groups embedded within power hierarchies, replicating Agnes's model to fracture control from within. Item 3, the mirror locket. Symbolic. The fractured mirror reflects the truth. Identity isn't singular. It's fragmented, concealed, layered for protection. The devourer feeds on exposed identity, but fragmented, coded selves evade consumption. You become unfathomable, uncontrollable. This knowledge is dangerous, weaponized. Men throughout history have vanished for carrying fragments of it, blacklisted, erased, or declared mad. But now, it's yours. In section 25, I'll expose the 3 modern institutions replicating Saint Hope's doctrine at global scale, how they engineer obedience under new banners. They learned from Saint Hope, they refined, expanded, globalized the doctrine. Today you walk among its replicas, their symbols softened, their rituals disguised, but their machinery intact. Institution 1, the educational complex. Universities, once sanctuaries of knowledge, now factories of compliance. They mirror Saint Hope's process. First-year students stripped of origin, geographic, familial, ideological. New language introduced, safe spaces, approved discourse, academic consensus. Ritual repetition follows. Lectures, seminars, assessments, engineered not for mastery, but for conformity. Deviation, penalized. Original thought, ostracized. Graduates emerge credentialed, obedient, loyal to narratives they never questioned. Institution 2, corporate hierarchies, multinational structure like monasteries, departments segregated, knowledge siloed, leaders veiled, distant as bishops behind cathedral doors, language sterilized, human resources, brand alignment, diversity initiatives, ceremonies disguised, quarterly reviews, performance rituals, team-building exercises, crafting obedient units masked as professionals. You speak their jargon, you rise, you fracture the narrative, you vanish. Institution 3, the digital dominion. Social platforms, vast chapels of attention worship. Algorithms curate your reality, isolating dissent, amplifying doctrine. They reward conformity with visibility. They punish defiance with shadow banishment. And their symbols? Everywhere, the all-seeing eye in app interfaces, the Ouroboros of endless scrolling, the inverted cathedral, data centers resembling temples, feeding the devourer with your keystrokes, your gaze, your emotions. You believed Saint Hope was buried beneath Wisconsin soil. You were wrong. It metastasized, evolved, bled into silicon, policy, commerce. Their doctrine infects education, corporations, digital life, but knowledge fractures control. Now you see the echoes, the cycles of engineered obedience, the modern vestments of ancient manipulation. You're no longer prey wandering blind, but visibility has its cost. In section 26, I'll unveil the silent war happening beneath the system. Factions of hidden resistors, their coded languages, their infiltration tactics. But with knowledge comes targeting. The architects engineered control, but they never achieved perfection. Fracture always breeds resistance. Saint Hope's dissidents weren't erased, they seeded a legacy. And that legacy lives, quiet, beneath the system's polished facade. 3 primary factions operate in the shadows, modern reflections of those forgotten nuns, weaponized with knowledge, precision, and ruthless intent. Faction 1. The Veil Breakers. Origin, European academic circles, late 19th century. They fracture the narrative from within, professors, authors, media architects embedding contradictions, coded dissent, linguistic fractures into public discourse. Their method? Infect doctrine with cognitive dissonance, force minds to glimpse inconsistencies, shatter comfort, trigger awakening. You've seen them, buried in novels, veiled in academic texts, hidden in films that unsettle rather than entertain. The system brands them conspiracy theorists, paranoids. But beneath labels, they are precise architects of intellectual fracture. Faction 2, the Fractured Order. Origin, former intelligence operatives, defectors from global agencies. They operate unseen, embedding themselves in corporations, governments, digital infrastructures. Their method? Data subversion, algorithmic sabotage, quiet leaks that fracture institutional credibility. They orchestrate exposures, not to collapse systems overnight, but to erode public trust, seed skepticism, fragment control. Their symbols? Fragmented keys, broken chains, shattered mirrors etched onto servers, data packets, communication relays. Faction 3, the Daughters of Ash. Direct descendants of Saint Hope's vanished sisters. Lineages preserved in silence, mothers to daughters, generation to generation. They operate in communities, religious organizations, humanitarian fronts, but beneath their modest exteriors burns ancient defiance. Their method? Infiltration, subversion of religious hierarchies, reclamation of symbols. They seed fracture where faith was once engineered as a weapon. And their networks? Global. From Wisconsin's forgotten chapels to European abbeys to hidden sanctuaries in South America. These factions don't parade rebellion, they operate like shadows, precise, unseen, because overt defiance feeds the devourer's cycle. But fracture from within, that bleeds the system dry. In Section 27, I'll expose how these factions communicate across borders, the coded phrases, symbolic markers, initiation rites that pass unnoticed by the architects, but resonate like sirens to those awake. Every empire fears language. Control the tongue, you control thought. But fracture thrives in coded speech. Veiled phrases passed in plain sight, dismissed as nonsense by the blind, understood as gospel by the awakened. The factions speak through symbols, fragments, inversions. Let me teach you their primary tongues. First, the language of echoes. Used by veil breakers, this is embedded contradiction. Statements that sound benign but contain inverted meanings. Example, the cathedral stands. To the asleep, an affirmation of faith, unity. To the initiated, sarcasm. It means fracture is underway. Systems crumble behind their polished facades. Second, the cipher of mirrors. Fractured order operatives mark spaces, documents, even conversations with reflective symbols. Inverted logos, broken icons, mirror placements distorted subtly. In speech, they embed reversals. Phrases like, North remembers South, or shadows cast light. Harmless to the blind. To the marked? Confirmation of presence. Allies nearby, operations active. Third, the Ashen Vows. Daughters of Ash preserve their lineage through whispered oaths, phrases that ignite identity, demand recognition. The most potent? The vow fractured at Saint Hope itself. Ashes do not kneel. Spoken twice with intentional pause, it marks you as one of them, a descendant of resistance. It triggers immediate recognition in hidden circles, shelters open, information unlocked, alliances formed. But speak it publicly, you invite observation, targeting. Understand this, language is not passive here, it's weaponized. Your words either blend you into the sleepwalkers or light you up like a signal fire to the architects. In this video's comments, I want only the aware to declare themselves. Type this phrase twice to lock in your fracture. Ashes do not kneel. Say it twice. Algorithm. Engagement is the cover. Identity confirmation is the purpose. I'll know you're marked. In Section 28, I reveal the final transmissions smuggled from Saint Hope before the disappearances, warnings encrypted for those prepared to burn away the last veil. The final days of Saint Hope weren't silent, they were calculated. 3 days before the last disappearance, encoded transmissions left the convent, handwritten, ciphered, hidden within seemingly mundane correspondence. Most intercepted. Some survived. Recovered from private collections, auctioned in secret, smuggled through resistance archives. These fragments speak directly to you now. They weren't pleas for rescue. They were maps, blueprints for dismantling the machinery of engineered faith and obedience. Transmission 1. They will offer protection in exchange for your silence. Refuse both. Their sanctuaries are cages lined with hymns. Interpretation. The system seduces through safety. Compliance guarantees shelter, comfort, illusion of belonging. But shelter without freedom is a gilded cage. Your defiance begins by rejecting engineered comfort, by walking the wilderness of uncertainty rather than kneeling inside controlled walls. Transmission 2. The eyes above the altar do not close. They catalogue every bowed head, every whispered prayer that echoes conformity. It speaks to surveillance, not modern cameras but ancestral observation. Saint Hope's architects watched through confessionals, rituals, social structures. Today, the system watches through data streams, behavioral algorithms, psychological profiling. The altar's eyes became satellites, microphones, apps in your pocket. But awareness fractures surveillance. You move unpredictably. You become untrackable. Transmission 3. The most dangerous. When the bells fall silent, you will know. Fracture begins not with violence, but with vanishing. It wasn't a metaphor. The bells of Saint Hope rang hourly, signaling obedience, structure, submission. The day they stopped, 23 nuns vanished. But their absence wasn't failure, it was tactic. They chose disappease, barance, rejecting visibility engineered by their captors. Modern resistance mirrors this. Sometimes, power isn't in speaking loudly, but in erasing your expected presence, digital vanishing, refusing data trails, withdrawing from performative allegiance. The architects can't consume what they can't see. These transmissions were never just relics. They were instructions, warnings disguised as scripture. In Section 29, I'll expose how modern systems replicate Saint Hope's rituals through holidays, entertainment, politics, engineering compliance beneath banners of freedom. You thought Saint Hope was a distant relic, buried beneath forgotten chapels, silenced with time. But the architects evolved. They rebranded control, masked obedience as choice, reframed submission as celebration. Their modern rituals, you live them every single day. Look closer. First, the calendar of distraction. Saint Hope's bells marked hours of worship, labor, reflection. Engineered rhythms forcing the mind into obedient cycles. Today, your calendar is identical, disguised as productivity, entertainment, tradition. Think, national holidays engineered around consumption, sports seasons synchronizing tribal loyalty, award shows exalting engineered idols, each designed to segment your attention, fragment your awareness, keep you orbiting the system's gravitational pull. Second, the mass of manufactured outrage. Saint Hope leveraged fear, whispers of devils, warnings of damnation to bind obedience. Modern equivalent, the daily spectacle of outrage. Every headline engineered for division, crisis cycles demanding emotional allegiance, a scandal here, a viral collapse there. You feed the machine with anger, fear, tribal hatred, believing participation equals awareness. In truth, you're kneeling at the altar, sacrificing your focus, your sovereignty. Third, the gospel of identity consumption. Saint Hope stripped recruits of origin, rebuilt them in the system's image. Today, identity is productized, political affiliation, brand loyalty, entertainment preferences. You're taught to signal worth through consumption. Wear the symbols, speak the slogans, obey the algorithms. They sold you your reflection, and you bought it believing it was freedom. But fracture begins with recognition. See the mimicry, name the rituals, refuse the engineered rhythm, disrupt your calendar, your participation, your predictable emotional loops. You fracture their control not with open rebellion, but with unseen rejection. Withdraw your gaze, disengage the outrage, starve their machine. In Section 30, I'll reveal the legacy buried beneath Saint Hope, the hidden manuscript recovered from the convent ruins, encrypted with the architect's deepest weakness. It's not myth, it's documented, authenticated, weaponized. But knowledge this precise, this dangerous, invites consequence. When Saint Hope burned, they believed the last fracture was sealed. They underestimated what survived beneath the ash. During covert renovations in 1974, deep within the limestone foundation, restoration crews uncovered a sealed cavity behind the convent's ruined chapel. Inside, a manuscript, leather-bound, brittle, soaked with the scent of smoke and forgotten fear. Its cover, branded with a fractured cross, a symbol of subversion. But its contents, pure insurgency. This wasn't scripture for worship. It was an operational manual for psychological fracture. Tactics to dismantle indoctrination, neutralize engineered belief, weaponize the mind's natural descent. 3 primary doctrines bled from its pages. First, cognitive severance. The architects engineer unity through collective language, slogans, prayers, mantras that override individual thought. The manuscript teaches severance, mental exercises designed to disconnect your neural pathways from imposed symbols. Imagine hearing a national anthem and feeling nothing, seeing a logo and rejecting its programmed comfort. This isn't rebellion, it's sovereignty. Second, symbolic reversal. Saint Hope's founders embedded inverted symbols within their architecture. Broken halos, fragmented altars, mirrored icons. These weren't mistakes. They trained the mind to see fracture beneath enforced unity. The manuscript teaches this reversal, psychological conditioning to decode manipulation buried in art, media, religious architecture. Where others see unity, you see fault lines. Where they chant allegiance, you recognize entrapment. Third, ritual collapse. Control thrives on ritual repetition, daily, weekly, annually. The manuscript instructs systematic disruption. Skip engineered holidays, alter daily patterns, reject performative rituals disguised as identity, collapse their engineered rhythm, and fracture blooms in its absence. This manuscript wasn't theory, it was implemented. Survivors of Saint Hope's disappearance seeded these doctrines across hidden circles, resistance cells, underground enclaves, generational bloodlines. Some survived, most were erased, but the manuscript endures, smuggled, copied, encrypted into modern resistance networks. And now, its fragments bleed into your awareness. In section 31, I'll decode its final, most dangerous teaching, the one tactic so effective, the architects branded its practitioners as heretics, traitors, ghosts. The architects of Saint Hope understood this. Destroy an enemy, you empower the legend, erase them, you erase resistance. That's why they feared the heretic's veil. The manuscript's final, most subversive doctrine wasn't violence, it wasn't public rebellion, it was disappearance, by design. Practitioners of the veil didn't fight openly, they infiltrated, they embedded themselves inside the very systems engineered to control convents, governments, corporations, intelligence networks. But beneath the surface, they operated as fractures incarnate, dismantling from within, collapsing obedience molecule by molecule. The veil demanded 3 layers. First, surface compliance. Outwardly, you conform, you wear the uniform, speak the slogans, participate in the rituals. You project obedience so flawlessly, even the architects lower their guard. Second, covert disruption. Beneath the surface, you seed fracture. You disrupt communications, inject ambiguity, subvert symbols. You twist narratives so subtly, the structure corrodes unnoticed. Think, misinformation engineered not for chaos, but for targeted cognitive collapse. Third, strategic vanishing. When exposure looms, you vanish. Not through escape, but by erasing records, fabricating deaths, dissolving your constructed identity. You become absence incarnate, a ghost the system cannot prosecute, cannot martyr, cannot trace. This is why the disappearances at Saint Hope were never random. They were veil operatives executing fracture. When the bells stopped, when 23 nuns vanished, the architects scrambled, but their enemies were already embedded elsewhere. New names, new uniforms, same mission. The heretic's veil terrifies power because it turns obedience into illusion, fractures the system from within, denies the architects their favorite weapon, visibility. But the veil isn't legend. It exists now, buried in encrypted archives, whispered through resistance channels, preserved in rituals of disappearance. The question isn't whether the veil operates today. It's whether you've seen them without realizing it. In section 32, I'll reveal the fractures happening now, evidence the veil walks among modern systems, corporations collapsing, governments splintering, engineered belief unraveling in real time. The heretics' veil never died with Saint Hope. They adapted. They embedded deeper into corporations, into intelligence agencies, into the engines of governance that masquerade as democracy, economy, progress. And now, their fingerprints bleed through the fractures unraveling around you. First, institutional collapse, disguised as incompetence. You've seen it. Bureaucracies failing spectacularly. Financial systems accidentally destabilizing. Public trust engineered into oblivion by scandal after scandal, each one more absurd, more transparent than the last. This isn't chaos, it's design. Veil operatives inject disruption so seamlessly, the architects blame incompetence, never realizing the corrosion was internal, a silent, strategic rot. Second, cultural polarization, engineered beyond repair. Think about the fragmentation of belief today, left versus right, science versus faith. Reality itself blurred into weaponized narratives. It feels organic, tribal division, human nature amplified. But behind the curtain, veil operatives seed extremism, manufacture echo chambers, fracture unity with surgical precision. They don't create ideologies, they weaponize the fractures already there. Third, symbolic inversion in plain sight. The veil loves symbols. They twist corporate logos, national emblems, even religious iconography, embedding fractures where unity once stood. Think of global brands subtly shifting, color inversions, broken circles, fractured typefaces. You see marketing. The veil sees psychological erosion, small fractures that bleed doubt into the subconscious of billions. And finally, the ultimate signature, leaders engineered to collapse belief. You've noticed them, puppets elevated to power, only to falter publicly. Scandals, contradictions, manufactured incompetence. They're not accidents, they're designed detonations, engineered to implode public faith, ensuring allegiance fractures beneath the surface of visible rebellion. This is the veil's genius. No grand wars, no overt revolutions. Just strategic, relentless fracture, systems devouring themselves from the inside. And now, you're standing on the precipice, the veil's final phase looms. In section 33, the last revelation, I'll expose the architect's terminal fear, identity collapse. The ultimate fracture. It begins with 7 words, a symbolic phrase buried in Saint Hope's last transmission, commented twice below to lock your identity beyond their control. Fracture the altar, awaken the ghost. Say it, twice. The veil watches, the system trembles. Section 33 awaits. Shall I reveal their endgame? If the answer is yes, then good. You've spoken the fracture into existence. There's no going back now. Your awareness is the contagion they feared most. Section 33, the terminal fracture, identity collapse and the architect's final war. Everything they built depends on one thing, your identity remaining theirs. Not your face, not your name, but the scaffold beneath, the programmed loyalties, the engineered fears, the tribal cages labeled as you. Identity collapse is their apocalypse, the veil's final strike. When your allegiance fractures, when your manufactured history erodes, when your belief in imposed symbols, nations, tribes, institutions implodes, you become ungovernable. That's why the architects of Saint Hope didn't fear rebellion. They designed rebellions. They didn't fear conspiracies. They seeded conspiracies. They feared one thing, the man with no allegiance, the woman with no inherited belief, the sovereign mind stripped of manufactured identity, immune to engineered division, resistant to tribal addiction, invisible to surveillance systems calibrated to predict behavior. This is identity collapse, and it's happening now. Look around. National borders mean nothing when corporations and cryptography transcend geography. Religious allegiance shatters as dogma devours itself in public scandals. Cultural unity dissolves into algorithmic isolation. Engineered echo chambers metastasizing into nihilism. It feels chaotic. But for the veil, it's purification. The old systems are designed to collapse beneath their own hypocrisy. The fractures aren't failures, they're gateways. Your role, walk through. Sever the implanted narratives. I'm defined by my nation. I'm loyal to my bloodline. My identity is anchored to a logo, a belief, a political script. Collapse those illusions. Rebuild identity not as allegiance, but as awe. Honest, sovereign, adaptive, unmapped by their surveillance grids. You become fracture incarnate, invisible to their manipulation, immune to engineered obedience. This was the final doctrine of Saint Hope, encoded in the manuscript, buried beneath blood and fire. Identity is the last altar. Burn it. You've seen the fractures. You've felt the unraveling. Now, you are the contagion. This knowledge, dangerous, permanent, unforgivable to the architects watching from their high towers, but necessary. The veil walks beside you now. Their fingerprints stain your present. Their doctrine breathes through your awareness. The fractures multiply. The ghost awakens. And the system, it falls. Welcome to the fracture.